Hello, welcome to Biology 101. This is Professor Jessica Wumple, and I will be your instructor throughout this semester. This first chapter will be broken up into three parts, essentially sections 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 in your Campbell Biology in Focus textbook. You are welcome to listen to the lectures, read the book, do both, choose one over the other, do whatever feels comfortable for you. These lectures will follow the book very closely, as will our classroom assignments. The book is considered a required textbook, and I expect that you are familiar with the topics in it, where they are located, and how they relate. So please plan to bring that. And please plan on having watched the lectures and or read the book and taken detailed notes before each class. So chapter 1 is just kind of a general overview of the topic of biology, and we'll hit some of the highlights, some of the things that we're going to discuss throughout the semester. Our semester basically consists of chapters 1 through 20. There's a few in there that we skip, and this section covers everything from chemistry, so biology at the molecular level, up through the cell, a little bit of genetics, and then we get into evolution at the end and start talking about how our cells pass on information and how that information changes in a population over time. In each of our PowerPoints, usually the first one for each chapter, you'll have a list of learning objectives. This is not the same as your study guide. This is just sort of the main topics in our lecture, the things that by the end of the chapter you should know about, you should be able to describe, you should know the vocabulary words that go along with each of them. If you check Blackboard under each chapter, there'll be a study guide, some more detailed set of questions that relate to the learning objectives. That will also give you a list of assigned reading. It will give you assigned labs that are associated with the unit. It'll give you a list of vocabulary words and then study questions to help kind of guide your notes and get you through studying these chapters. So as you can see from these learning objectives, we're going to sort of talk about the common characteristics for living organisms, how biologists categorize and organize living systems and living organisms, and then we'll talk a little bit about evolution just kind of in the broad sense because it does impact pretty much everything that we talk about in this first unit. And then one of the big focuses of this unit will be the scientific method. So we'll have a lab on the scientific method. You'll be expected to understand how to use and apply the scientific method. So let's start with the definition of biology. Biology is the scientific study of life. So if you look at the word, bio means life, ology is the study of, so study of life. So biology encompasses a huge range of fields. This can be anything from biochemists who are studying the biological molecules that make up our cells and help run our bodies. This can be cellular biologists, those people who are studying the mechanisms of the cell. It can be geneticists, it can be organismal biologists, and then all sorts of things sort of fall into this category. You've got all of the medical fields, veterinary fields, all variety of sort of conservation biology, ecologists, organismal biologists, and pretty much everything in between. So biologists are studying how organisms behave, how they function, how they grow, how they interact, and just sort of looking at how they function within their living world. So some of biology is how the world surrounding those organisms impacts them and how they impact their environment as well. As I said a few minutes ago, though, we're mostly going to be focusing on sort of cellular level biology, the molecules that make up those organisms, how the cells function, how they use energy, and then how cells pass on information. So we don't really get into organismal level biology in this course. That's really saved for Biology 102. So if we look at living organisms, we see some common things common themes that are sort of organization or concepts that we find no matter what living organism we're talking about. So we're going to go through some of these different themes, starting with organization. So we're going to talk about how organisms are built, how populations and groups of organisms and ecosystems are built. We're going to talk about how organisms and cells pass on information from one generation to the next. We'll talk a little bit about how organisms transform energy in their environment, how they move matter around an ecosystem. We'll talk a little bit about how organisms interact with their environment, and then we'll talk about evolution, which is a really big theme in our textbook, sort of how organisms change over time. We'll study some of these in a bit more detail in Biology 101, so some of these are going to be really brief. In fact, all of them are going to be really brief. And then your transfer of energy and matter and interaction with the environment, and some bit of evolution will continue on in Biology 102. So let's start with how our planet and our ecosystems, how our groups of organisms are organized. So biologists love to categorize things. They like to put them into neat little groups and sort of study how each level of those systems or organisms, how each level interacts with the organism as a whole or with its environment. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So life ranges from the sort of microscopic level all the way up to our biosphere, our entire planet, all of the living organisms on Earth. And so we're going to step through each of these very briefly and just sort of discuss what happens at each level. I like to start with the molecules because that's where our textbook starts. That's where our course starts. But this diagram shows us from the top level down, so we'll follow that flow today. So at the very top, we have our biosphere. So the biosphere is just a fancy name for Earth. It's basically life sphere, all of the living organisms on our planet. So this is every living thing that you can think of, from humans to animals to plants to fungi to bacteria, any living thing. You can think of the Earth as just one huge ecosystem. And what happens in one part of the planet is absolutely going to affect what happens in another part of the planet. It might be a small effect. You might see local environments affecting other environments, or it might be something big like a global change in weather patterns. One step down from that is an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is all of the living and non-living components in a specific area. And so it's the way that living organisms interact with the environment around them. So this example that we have here is a mountain meadow. You can see mountains in the background there. You can see the wildflowers in the front, and you can see the trees in the back. And so if you think about all of the components that you would encounter in this environment, you might have wind, you might have weather such as snow or rain. It might be dry that time of the year. You've got all of those plants. You've got all of the animals that you could think of. This might be mice, it might be deer, it might be birds, and then it's certainly bacteria that live in the soil and insects that are pollinating those flowers. And then we've also got all of the sort of chemicals, the air, the nutrients in the soil, the nutrients in the water. All of that is the ecosystem. And all of those components affect one another, and they affect what organisms can live there and how they interact with their environment. One step below that, we have communities. So communities are groups of living organisms. So once we hit communities, we're talking about life specifically. We're not necessarily talking about the environment as we are at the level of the ecosystem, although the environment around them certainly impacts them. But communities are all of the living creatures that are present. So you can see in this picture we've got some mule deer, we've got several different types of flower. That purple flower there is called a lupine. You've got the pine trees behind. You can imagine all of the birds singing, all of the rodents in the grass, and each one of those living organisms is part of that community. It affects who can live there, it affects what they eat, it affects how they interact. So you can also think of this in human terms. So you might think of the community around campus. You have different populations. You have families. You have the population on campus. You have population at an elementary school. You have individuals in an apartment complex. All of these different people. And then also part of that community are the pets that we have, the animals that live in and around our neighborhoods. The deer in the field, the red-tailed hawk, and the mice, all of those are part of our community on campus. So down one lower level are populations. So populations, in the most strict definition, are all of the organisms of the same species in the same area that interbreed. So here we've gone down to our fourth level, our lupine flower. You might also think of the population of mule deer or the population of a particular type of pine tree in this environment. But in this case, we're talking about a mountain meadow, and so our population is the purple lupine flowers that are in this specific meadow. Populations may or may not be isolated from other groups of the same species, so there might be another meadow a few yards away and maybe they exchange pollen, so those might not be isolated from one another. But populations can be isolated, they can have limited interaction with other groups, and that'll get really important when we start talking about evolution. But when we're talking about populations, we're talking about the interaction between all of the individuals of the same species. So how they are sharing nutrients, how they are competing for nutrients, how they are reproducing, who they're reproducing with. And that's why we get this part of our definition that says that they are the same species and interbreed. Population are all the same type of organism. Our next level down from populations are organisms. And this is getting to be a little bit closer to what we talk about in this class. So organisms are just what you would probably think they are. They're a single individual in an environment. So this might be a single mule deer in our mountain meadow ecosystem. But in this case, our book is following the lupine flower. So the lupine flower is made up of all of those levels down below. If you think about a person, you can think of a person in the same way. We are made up of all these different parts that function together, and without one of your parts you wouldn't be a fully functional individual. And same thing with this flower. Each one of the parts has a very specific structure and has a very specific function. And structure and function are something we're going to come back to in just a little bit. It's something we're going to revisit throughout the semester. So just sort of keep this idea of specific structures that give an organism specific functions as we're going through the rest of this lecture. So down below organisms we have organs. In this case we've got the leaf. So think about what the leaf does for this organism. So the leaf performs photosynthesis, and we'll come back to photosynthesis. In fact, we have a whole chapter on photosynthesis. But our leaf performs photosynthesis, and that's a really important organ in this plant because it brings in energy and it stores it as chemical energy for this plant. And so here we have this sort of broad, flat leaf. It's got a flat surface, and that's related to its function, which is to absorb sunlight. So it needs to maximize its surface area. Down below that, we have tissues. So the tissues that make up this plant are all of the parts of the plant that are, the leaf, that are important for photosynthesis. And the tissues in the leaf are going to be different than the tissues in the stem and the tissues in the flower, but some of them are going to be continuous. Some of them are tissues that move nutrients and water through the plant, and they're similar no matter which part of the organism or which part of the organ they're in. But other tissues are a little bit more specific. And in this case, we're looking at something called the mesophyll. This is a layer on the outside of the leaf, and that layer of tissue contains specific cells. So we're going down one more level in our organization. And these cells are the smallest unit that are considered life. So some organisms, like our plant or our mule deer or people, are made up of millions and millions of cells, or maybe just a few cells. But these multicellular organisms require multiple cells for them to function. Other organisms are bacteria, and a similar group called archaea that you may not be as familiar with are single-celled organisms. So these are single-celled individuals that are fully functional as a single cell. And so some of these characteristics of our cells are basically the minimum requirements for life. And we'll come back to some of those very specific characteristics of cells in just a little bit. So down below that are organelles. Organelles are just little organs. They're the parts of the cell that make it run. So if we go back to that cell, we see those little green sort of round structures within there. That is our organelle, called a chloroplast. So that chloroplast is actually the functional organ of the cell that is absorbing sunlight, capturing that energy, and converting it into sugar. So it's performing a very specific function within that cell that allows that cell to survive and be a part of the bigger organism. Down below that, we have our molecules. So this is our lowest level, basically, that our book goes into. And this is where we're going to start. Chapter 2 starts with chemistry. It starts with the molecules that make up living organisms. So these are the smallest structures. If you've had chemistry before, you know about the periodic table. You know how all of those atoms sort of work together to make these functional molecules. And so again, we have structure and function. In this case, we have a chlorophyll molecule. So this is a group of atoms that come together in a very specific arrangement that allows them to absorb light and allows them to be part of a process that produces sugar. It produces a means to store energy for these plants. So as I said, biologists like to organize things. We like to classify things. We like them in these neat little packages. And one thing that's really cool that comes from this special organization is this idea of emergent properties. So emergent properties are new functions that arise with increased complexity. So new properties arise as we move upward in this hierarchy of life. So if we start with our molecules and we arrange them in a particular way, we get a new function. We get this chlorophyll molecule. And then we arrange our chlorophyll molecules together along with a few other molecules, some fats and some proteins, and you get this organelle, this chloroplast that can absorb sunlight and store it as sugar. And then a variety of different organelles, maybe some more chloroplasts and some other organelles, the nucleus and some other things we'll learn about shortly, are organized into the cell. And the cell has that very specific function either on its own or within an organism. And it is that collection of organelles and molecules that allows the cell to live. So you can sort of think of this as new properties that weren't there before. And if you look at this picture of the bicycle, so I've got this bicycle here, and it's an artistic rendition of a bicycle. I just thought was a cool picture. But if you think about a bicycle and you get on the bicycle and you ride it, but maybe you didn't buy your bicycle in pieces, but if for some reason your bicycle is in pieces on your garage floor, it no longer has its function. You can't get on it and ride it because the wheel's not attached to the gears and the chain and the handlebar and the frame. But once you put that bike together, once its structure is arranged properly and everything is tightened down and the chain is attached to the wheels, you now have this new function. You have this new property that wasn't there before the pieces of the bike were organized together. And so on our previous page, our diagram of these levels of organization, you see that process with photosynthesis. You see those organelles arranged into cells and cells arranged into tissues and organs and eventually up to the plant. And we see this huge tree here reaching its branches up to the sky and sort of gathering all that sunshine. And all of that is made possible by this organization of the different components that give these new properties as it becomes more organized. I mentioned structure and function a few minutes ago, and it's very, very closely related to emergent properties. So these structures at each level of organization allow for those emergent properties, allow for those new functions with each level. But we also see very specific structures in living organisms that are perfectly made for their function. So we've sort of beat photosynthesis to death already, and we will continue to do so. We talk about it quite a bit. But if you look down at this diagram here, we've got our chloroplast organelle, and then we have an artistic rendition of the chloroplast. And if you look, there are these structures called granum, and you don't need to know those structures right now, but those are the structures that are filled with our chlorophyll molecule that are absorbing the sunlight. And as we get to photosynthesis, we'll talk about some of those structures and what they do, why they are so important for photosynthesis. But again, we've got our leaves and we've got our leaf structure that are all made specifically for this process of photosynthesis. So one thing I like, one example that I really like that our book uses of structure and function are the hummingbird shoulder. The hummingbird shoulder is made specifically so that those birds can hover. These tiny birds flap their wings really, really quickly, and it allows them to hover in front of these flowers and drink the nectar from these flowers. That hovering is made possible by the wings, the shoulder for the hummingbird wing, and its structure. And that structure of the shoulder allows it to rotate forward and backwards and almost in a figure-8 shape rather than in one direction. So if you think about most birds, they flap their wings up and down, or if you wave your arms up and down, they're one direction, just up and just down. But that structure within the hummingbird wing allows it to hover, which is really important for the way that it gathers its food. Let's continue our discussion of biological organization by talking about cells. So cells are the smallest level of structure that can perform all activities of life. So we'll be talking in a few minutes about energy transfer and passing on of genetic information, dealing with the environment. And so the cell is really the lowest level that can sort of interact with the environment, take in energy, transform it, and it relies on the molecules and in some cases the organelles in those cells to actually do those things. So we'll see in a minute that some organisms are single-celled organisms and others are multicellular, which just means that the organism is made up of more than one cell. So all cells share some particular characteristics. All cells are enclosed in a membrane. That membrane is generally made up of phospholipids. That's a phosphate and a fat sort of put together to isolate it from the environment, to give it protection, to help regulate movement of materials between the cell and the surroundings, and also to isolate the activities that go on in that cell from the external environment, and in some cases from the internal environment within the cell. All cells contain DNA. DNA is our genetic material. And all cells use and transform energy in some way. And the energy source depends on the organism, it depends on the type of cell, but all living organisms are going to interact with their environment and use energy. So both our prokaryotic cell and our eukaryotic cell have to be able to deal with their environment. So the two major types of cells are the prokaryotic cell and the eukaryotic cell. The prokaryotic cell is going to be our single-celled organisms. It's a cell that lives all on its own. And these make up our two big domains in biology, the bacteria and the archaea. So those are both single-celled organisms. And the things that sort of separate this from eukaryotic cells are, one, that these organisms live as single-celled organisms, but another one is that they don't have organelles. So they lack that biological organization level of organelle, and they still have the surrounding membrane, but the DNA inside the cell is not enclosed, so we say it has no nucleus, and then it doesn't have those organelles. That doesn't mean that the prokaryotic cell can't perform many of the same functions as our cells with organelles, and in fact they do perform many of the same functions. They're just not isolated within specific organelles. Prokaryotic cells also quite frequently have a cell wall. So if you look, the sort of dark line around our prokaryotic cell is both a cellular membrane and also a cell wall, which gives it kind of a more rigid structure, a little bit more protection from the environment, and helps regulate substances that move in or out. They also tend to be smaller than eukaryotic cells. You can see the size difference if you see that scale down there at the bottom. Much, much smaller. Eukaryotic cells are 10 to 100 times bigger than prokaryotic cells. So moving on to our eukaryotic cells, all of the organisms that are made up of more than one cell are called eukaryotes. And they are basically anything that's not a bacteria or an archaea. And they're probably the organisms that you're more familiar with. The plants, the animals, the fungi. There's another group of eukaryotes called the protists. We'll talk about all those in a minute. But these eukaryotic cells make up these eukaryotic organisms. So a eukaryotic organism would be made up of many, many cells. Eukaryotic cells are larger, they're more complex, they have their DNA contained in the nucleus. So that big purple organelle there in the center of the eukaryotic cell is the nucleus. That's usually the largest organelle, and that's where all of the genetic information for the cell is contained. All those other colorful splotches and things that you see in there, those are the other organelles, and we'll talk about what those are and what they do when we get to chapter 4. But they all perform various functions, and they are important because they isolate those functions from the rest of the cell. So they allow those regions of the cell to perform very specific functions. And we'll get to those later. Right now I just want you to understand the major differences between these two types of cells. So if we're talking about our nucleus, or even our nuclear region, our nucleoid in the prokaryotic cells, this is where our DNA resides, no matter what type of cell you are. The DNA is contained in a specific location. So that brings us to our next sort of big theme in biology, which is continuity of life. So what this means is that there's information that is passed from one generation to the next. And this molecule of DNA is what houses all of that genetic information that codes for what makes you you. It gives all of the instructions for making, building your body and making proteins and running the metabolic processes that occur, whether it is a prokaryotic cell or a really complex eukaryotic organism like a mammal. So we'll get into more specifics about DNA structure a little bit later in this semester, but a few things I wanted to point out. The overall structure of DNA is a double helix. So this is a really large biological molecule that's made up of a bunch of different parts. And that blue ribbon structure that you see there is called the backbone. And in between the backbones of this molecule are 4 bases. So if you talk about the DNA sequence, excuse me again, the DNA sequence, you're talking about the sequence of those 4 bases. So we have adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. That's the base that's covered up there. I was trying to move the DNA molecule and it forwarded my slide. But anyway, just general idea, DNA is a really long, complex molecule made up of these 4 bases. When organisms reproduce, they pass on this genetic information to the next generation, which is why organisms are similar to their parents. Information is passed on from parent to offspring, and that continues that genetic information. And one thing that's really important about this process through this continuity of life and continuity of information is maintaining that information. So we'll get to the process of replication, how the cell copies its DNA in preparation for passing it on, but the cell in the meantime maintains it. It takes care of the molecule. It sort of contains it in the nucleus so that nothing happens to it. It protects that information. DNA is stored in what we call chromosomes. So chromosomes are a large, long piece of DNA that contains all the genetic information. It contains, excuse me, contains genes, which are short segments of DNA sequence that produce some sort of product in the cell that allows the cell to function. So on the right there, we have this image of an X and Y chromosome. This is just an example of what a chromosome looks like tightly packed within a cell. All chromosomes are going to have an arm on either end, and we'll talk about this structure a little bit later, but I just wanted you to be familiar with chromosomes because we'll sort of talk about genetics a little bit throughout the semester, particularly when we talk about our nucleus and our organelles and things like that. So continuity of life is important in the process of gene expression. So all of our genetic information is housed in our DNA, but the DNA is really like a blueprint. We need to get the information from the DNA into something functional within the cell. And this process is called gene expression. And the process of gene expression goes from a particular DNA sequence through a series of steps down to a functional protein. So our book gives us this example here of the crystalline protein. So crystalline is a protein that's in the lens cells in your eyes. It picks up light. And so that gene for producing that protein is present in the DNA. So you find it in what we call the crystalline gene. That's represented there in the blue. So our DNA sequence is used to produce a short copy. So we remove the information from our DNA into something called an mRNA, a messenger RNA. And that messenger is sort of like taking a chapter out of the book. And then the the DNA in the cell, once it is turned into the mRNA, is then translated. So this process goes from your genetic information and turns it into a protein. And the proteins are really what work in the cell. They're what perform the functions in the cell. So this process of gene expression just takes us from our genetic information out to a functional product within the cell. So another example of this would be sickle cell disease. So we'll use this example of sickle cell quite a few times throughout the semester as sort of a demonstration of this process of gene expression and the effects of structure and function. And it's a really good example because it's very well studied. The disease is very well understood and all the way down to the DNA level. So if you look at the top there, it says sickle cell allele on chromosome. So that just means that's the location on the chromosome where you find that sickle cell gene. And sickle cell is a disorder where the red blood cells in your body are not formed correctly. They should be this nice, plump, round, almost donut-shaped looking structure. But instead, if an individual has the sickle cell disease, the red blood cells take this crescent shape. And this causes a lot of problems. They get clogged in the veins and arteries and clogged up in your muscles and cause a lot of pain and dysfunction in certain organs. But it also limits the function of the red blood cell, which is to carry oxygen throughout the cell. And this disease comes from a change in the DNA sequence. So on the bottom there we have the normal DNA sequence, and we see that that DNA sequence produces ultimately this normal red blood cell that flows nicely through veins and arteries, whereas that sickle cell gene has one base pair change. The only difference in the DNA sequence for this gene is one base pair, and it produces this misshapen hemoglobin, which then causes the red blood cells to be shaped incorrectly. To wrap up our discussion on continuity of life, I wanted to talk about the universal genetic code. So DNA is found in all living organisms on Earth. And this process of gene expression is really, really similar, whether you're a bacteria or you are a complicated mammal or other animal. There are absolutely differences between these processes, but the overall process is really similar. The molecules involved are all the same. And this shows that all life is related. It shows that living organisms came from a very distant common ancestor that used DNA and RNA as its genetic material. And this is where we sort of get into evolution. We'll come back to evolution as a theme in a few minutes. But this universal genetic code relates all organisms. This code is how organisms pass information to the next generation, and kind of going backwards from that, closely related species and closely related organisms are going to share a similar genetic code. And that's because of this ability of the cell to pass on its genetic information. So related to this, sequences of closely related species are more similar than those that are more distantly related. So all of these birds on the bottom, this flamingo, the robin, the penguin, they all share very similar DNA. Obviously there are some differences. You can see those differences, and those differences have a genetic basis. But they're going to be more similar to each other than they are to, say, a reptile or to a mammal. And this allows us to look at DNA sequences. It allows us to look at the physical characteristics of organisms and see how they're related, see how their gene sequences are related, and how similar and how dissimilar they are. We'll come back to this idea when we get into our evolution unit, and also in a few minutes I'll talk briefly about evolution. For now, I'm going to end this video and pick up on Chapter 1, Part 2.